Let me know in the comments how I can improve this video and future ones. If you found this helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content. As you can see, the shock shaft is bent, and today we're going to show you how to fix it. I've got a handy tip for you that will help protect your shock shaft. Start by wrapping the ends of the needle nose pliers with electrical tape. This simple step will prevent any damage to the shock shaft, ensuring it stays in great condition. This technique is especially useful if your shock shaft is still in good shape and you only need to replace the internal components of the shock. In this case, the shaft is already damaged, so it is an unnecessary step here. Use your pliers to grab the shock shaft as low as possible. Now twist the shock end to remove it. If you're having trouble getting it off, don't hesitate to use a hex tool to provide additional torque. This can make the process much easier. Remember the hex tool I mentioned earlier? Insert the tool into the shock cap and twist the body of the cap until they come apart. Now let's go ahead and drain the old shock oil. Make sure to get out as much of it as you can. This shock shaft is not just bent, it's also got some rust on it. That means I had to put in a little extra effort to get the job done. Now let's go ahead and remove the bottom retainer cap. Typically you can just do this by hand, but in this case I had to use a pair of pliers to get it started. After successfully removing the cap, I used the shock shaft to help extract the O-ring seal from the bottom of the shock body. It's important to note that there are several components involved. First, you'll encounter an O-ring, followed by a separator washer, and then another O-ring. Be sure to keep track of the order for easy reassembly. Look at how the old O-ring looks versus the new one. The old O-ring features what's known as an X-ring, which is often regarded as a superior design. However, for the purposes of this demonstration, I'll be using the standard O-ring style. Here I'm showing the removal of the bladder of the shock cap. While this step is often unnecessary, it can be crucial if you notice any leaks. The key aspect of this task is ensuring the bladder is properly seated when you put it back, which I'll demonstrate later in the video. In this step, we'll remove the E-clips and piston from the shock shaft using just a small flathead screwdriver. Simply insert the screwdriver between the top of the shaft and the E-clips opening, then twist and push to pry it open. Yeah, this step is harder than it looks, but once you get it, it's not so bad. Now remove the piston and do the same for the bottom E-clip. In this step, apply a bit of shock oil to your new O-rings. This will help seal the shock and provide some protection while reinstalling the shock shaft. Remember the order from earlier? Start with the first O-ring, followed by the spacer, and then another O-ring. After pushing it in, ensure it's flush with the bottom of the shock cap and that nothing is blocking the hole before reattaching the bottom retainer cap. Reattaching E-clips can be tricky, but here's a quick tip. For the first E-clip, simply place it on the bottom groove and use pliers to push it on, ensuring even pressure to avoid bending. It's sometimes easier to press it in using a table. Now, take the piston and push it down so you can see the top groove for the second E-clip. This is the hardest part for me, at least, on the smaller Traxxas shocks. The E-clip is nearly to the edge when trying to place it on. So there is a fine line between pushing on the E-clip and pushing on the piston. This process is only hard on shocks that uses smaller pistons with a larger E-clip like this. Once you get it snapped on, make sure you can spin the piston like it is in the video. You want the piston to be a bit free. Here I'm applying shock oil to the shaft so it has less chance of tearing up the new O-rings. The shaft threads can do the most damage, so make sure you get some oil on them. Here's a great tip. Before installing the shock shaft, cut 2 mm of fuel line and use a 2 mm intershock shaft limiter. The limiter retains oil at the bottom, improving shock response from full droop, while the fuel line prevents harsh bottoming out on big jumps. Together, they help keep your tires planted for better handling. Now place the shaft in the shock body and find the hole in the bottom. It should go in super smooth and easy. Don't force it in or you can tear the O-rings. And place the fuel line on the outside of the shaft like this. When reattaching the shock end, be sure to protect the new shock shaft with thick paper or electrical tape, as I've done here. Grab the shock as low as possible to minimize the risk of future leaks. Here's a quick tip. Don't twist the shock end all the way down. Leave 1 to 2 threads exposed to compensate for the limiter inside the shock, and the fuel line will prevent the threads from damaging the O-rings. Now take the bladder and place it in the shock cap. Make sure it's seated all the way down. If you are having a hard time getting it seated evenly, you can screw it on the shock body. This will sometimes help get it in place. Now let's fill the shock with oil. If you're unsure, start with 40 WT or 500 CST. It's a bit heavy but not too much. Fill it to the top, then move the shock shaft up and down to release any air bubbles. While some let it sit for a few minutes to get all the air out, it's not always necessary. Now place the cap a few threads down and compress the shock shaft all the way before tightening the cap, this ensuring zero rebound occurs. Traxxas recommends a half rebound, which can be achieved by tightening the cap and not compressing the shock. This will make the car more responsive, but potentially harder to drive. Many drivers prefer zero rebound for easier control. Also, if rebound is not even across all shocks, it can make the car drive out of balance. This is why I recommend zero rebound for simplicity and consistency, despite Traxxas' recommendation.